I'm KONN LAVERY. I write in multiple genres in horror, thriller, and dark fantasy. So horror tends to be like this underlining foundation of everything that I write. And on top of that, I do graphic design at home full time. So it gives me flexibility to work on the writing, go to conventions, and then adjust the schedule accordingly.
Hey, Todd Braley here. I'm a filmmaker and documentary filmmaker. I also own my own video production company, making a plethora of different things from web series to TV commercials to whatever you need.
My name is HENRIQUE, and I'm a director and producer. I would say about 2/3 of my output is horror, both as producer and director. Directed 16 features, produced 20-something. Just had 2 horror features come out in Walmart last week, which was really cool. Girl in the Crawl Space, which I produced, and Ouija Room, which I directed. And I even did a TV series on Amazon Prime called Boggy Creek, the series. I also dabble in podcasting. I have a show called Weekly Spooky where I narrate scary stories, and I just all around I'm just really a weirdo for a living. That's kind of what it is.
I'm Jim Nettles. I write science fiction, urban fantasy, a bit of horror, some comedy horror, a few dozen other things as James P. McDonald. I write nonfic as well as some futurist work in my other life. I also have an author services company. I do a lot of creative consulting, work for a lot of startups, and do, pretty much I'm a mercenary.
Horror is a genre of speculative fiction, which is intended to frighten, scare, disgust, or startle its readers or viewers by inducing feelings of horror and terror. It creates an eerie and frightening atmosphere. Horror is frequently supernatural, though it might also be non-supernatural. Often, the central menace of a work of horror can be interpreted as a metaphor or for larger fears of a society.
I mean, I think that's relatively accurate, although I'm not a huge fan of flowery academic phrasing. But I've always been fascinated by the idea of making a horror movie or a horror story versus making a scary movie or a scary story, because I feel like they're not necessarily, they're in the same ballpark but not necessarily the same thing, because there are plenty of horror movies that I don't believe ever really intended on scaring me in the traditional sense, but they definitely made me uncomfortable, unsettled me, titillated me, what have you. So I've always thought that horror was kind of a broader term for a broader kind of fear.
I think when we're talking about horror, and we really are diving into horror, is that idea of dread. It's not necessarily, like you say, the scare jump. Most of those I just find funny. And that probably goes to my sick and twisted sense of humor. But if you're looking and talking about true horror, it's digging deep into where we fear, where angels fear to tread, or at least we should. And what it stands for us as an allegory a lot of the time is we're pulling out those things. What is it we're afraid of? Why do we fear it? Because that also tells us a lot of the time fear is about what should it protect us from. The things that go bump in the night go back to when we were, sleeping in trees and afraid of being eaten in the middle of the night. So as we look at horror and dread and those sorts of things, it's really that fun part that gets to dig down and make us look at, why are we afraid of zombies? It's a political allegory. Why are we afraid of sparkly vampires? Well, we really shouldn't be. But to me, I think that's where it really gets down to. And people that love horror are also the people that are not afraid to look at the edges.
The thing that's interesting about horror is there's like the actual academic definition, which makes sense, and then there's the public perception, where a lot of people just presume horror to be the slashers, to be the scary campfire stories, where horror tends to underline a lot of other genres as well. Like the modern thriller is a kind of combination of action, mystery, and horror. So it kind of trickles its way into different forms of story without a lot of people knowing about it.
You know, growing up when I was a kid, I mean, you know, horror was Michael Myers, horror was Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, and that. And then, you know, as I got older, you know, and decided when I finally got around to making my first horror movie, because I'm kind of a drama guy. I found that realism in that genre, to me, things that could actually happen. You know, yes, Michael Myers could happen. Friday the 13th could happen, or to a point. Once you get past 4, then, you know, we'll just won't have a discussion anymore. And, you know, when I produced my movie Misfit about being bullied, that is, you know, that to me, because I was bullied as a kid, that was almost kind of like my pseudo revenge on the people who used to mess with me. And a lot of the stuff that happened in that movie was stuff that I had thought up in my head. Wouldn't it be nice to tie somebody to a chair and torture them with a scalpel? I mean, yeah, okay, I'm kind of sick, but that for me now, more or less, the horror aspect is more about, you know, what could actually happen.
Tonight, the city is under attack by what police are calling the haystack killer. The serial murderer claims his victims by using a hay hook. The haystack killer has claimed 10 lives so far, including a family of 4. As the manhunt continues, the chief of police had these words.
Kind of curious from each of you, how is it a different mindset that you have to get into? Is there something you have to do differently in your process to do a horror film rather than anything else that you might do? Is there something different that you feel or that you tap into that and is it a matter of knowing what scares you that helps the process?
Well, for me, you know, I've written several horror movies, but I've collaborated on an immense amount of horror movie screenplays where, you know, it's been me and a writer sitting down for 2 or 3 hours, just hammering out exactly what's up. And then, you know, having revision meetings and stuff like that. And what I've really learned helps me in the horror and thriller genre, which I appreciate the phrase thriller, but it's really just, horror, but like dressed up like a high class prostitute, It's like, oh, horror. That's you meet them in a seedy hotel room. A thriller, you go out to dinner with them. And, but when I've worked on horrors and thrillers, one thing that oddly enough has really paid off is my anxiety disorder. Because they'll sit there and describe a scene to me, and my mind automatically thinks of all the ways it can go wrong right away. Like, what is the worst that could happen? Well, it could turn out that you're tied to the table. And the only way to get out is to cut your own hand off or cut the person next to you's hand off. It's like, where's that coming from? I'm like, I don't know, but it needs to be medicated, my friend. So, I mean, for me, that's, understanding what scares you is just, it's like any other writing or creativity. For the most part, it's observation.
Yeah.
Whether I'm writing a comedy or I'm writing a horror, I'm just taking things that I've seen and I'm filtering them into the story. In fact, one of the best parts about horror genre as a director is you get to do whatever you want. I mean, there could be romance in a horror movie. There could be action in a horror movie. There could be drama. In fact, there's almost always drama in a horror movie. There could be all of those things. But if you reverse it, generally speaking, a romantic comedy does not have a horror scene.
Yeah.
It does not have
I've seen some really horrific.
Yeah.
The
horror, the traditional sense. That is it.
I made a romantic comedy where I did just that. I put a horror scene in it. They go on this like romantic date camping, and it's romantic, but then they start hearing noises and they get creeped out. But it's a romantic comedy, so it ends up becoming a joke. But yeah, you don't get to you get to paint with a really broad brush in horror, and you get to experiment with a lot of different genres, which is one of my favorite elements of it.
You have an awful lot of horror stuff.
Yeah, I write a lot of them.
Doesn't that get boring?
No way. Horror movies are special. I mean, they really let you paint with a broad brush. You can put anything you want to in them. I mean, they have romance and drama and action.
I have an idea. Let's do something spooky.
Somehow, this is not as scary as I'd hoped.
I wrote the backstory for the killer that you wanted.
I think you're overestimating your ability as a writer.
I think it's just about time for us to get into character.
God, Charlie. This place is so creepy. At night, does it always get so dark?
Do you even know what actually happened out here by these woods?
What do you mean?
Something I found with writing horror, especially when you're writing about someone that's obviously not you, whether it is the antagonist who could be the killer or the victim, is listening to the right people who have actually gone through these type of things, whether you're researching articles or you actually know people or get a chance to interview someone, is really sitting down and listening to what they say and using that kind of intuition and being observant, so you actually know how to transcribe those words, because you can't possibly know everything when you're writing, because you're only one person and you can't live all these different lives and be in these people's heads. So like watching interviews of serial killers or actually talking to victims will actually show you how they talk and their mannerisms, and you'll pick up on a lot that you can use in your own writing.
One of the things I'll throw out there, because it's not unusual for me to be speaking to a room of people about reality. When I'm out there dealing with things from more of a continuity standpoint, disaster recovery, privacy, security, I can terrify an entire room of people with nothing but fact. And I'm a sick individual because I find it fun, but even so, horror, when we're putting it in the fiction, part of it to me is we're exploring those things that really concern us. I mean, if we're going to go tell the story, the things we're going to dive into and tell the best are the things that we're wanting to explore as the storyteller. And so, I mean, a lot of the time the question becomes, and I'll say this out there, it's the difference between one-on-one, the one killer, the one stalker, and the one victim, or the sequence of victims. Or if you start talking about something that's just more random, virus, bacteria, biohazards, just indiscriminate, a bullet flies through a window. All of these things have definite horrific aspects. And the question becomes, when you're telling the story, what is it you're trying to explore? So as we're talking about true horror, a lot of what we see and we focus on is that aspect of the stalking. It's the anticipation. It's waiting for the monster to come get you, whether that monster is human or, troll too. But if you're looking at that and you're following that creeping factor, or if it's sometimes the scariest part is just that random thing that comes and that's what takes you out. It's one of those things that we have to explore as a storyteller is what is it that is concerning us most, so that we can tell that story and explore it for ourselves and hopefully get past that issue.
I totally see what you're saying there, Jim. A few years ago, I did a series that it was actually, we bought television time here locally and showed it on Saturday nights. It was called Surviving the Undead. And part of that series, the reason the zombies, as you find out later, are becoming who they are is because of something that got into the watershed, and it was actually put there it was put there by accident. But then at the same time, once it started happening, then the government people decided, well, let's see what happens and see where it goes.
I do a lot of panels where we start talking about things like CRISPR and gene editing and what people can do sitting in their home lab, and play along, and the next thing you know, create all sorts of fun things from bacteria that are sitting in the pond outside, or cold virus or stuff like that. Technology and science is both wonderful in what it gives us and what we can play with and do in our home labs now. And at the same time, it gets pretty terrifying if you know what people can do and there's no controls.
This is the cool thing about the horror genre, is it's versatile in the sense that you can make something campy, you could make something very, very scary, you could make something, try to be scary but it's not scary, it turns out to be funny. There's even, horror even landscapes into the educational field. How many of us took driver's ed, right? There's horror films in driver's ed. So
Blood on the streets.
Yeah. So horror really does transcend a bit.
You're sitting in a movie theater, you paid good money to sit there in this dark room with this giant screen with these really loud speakers, and then a thing happens and you jump. And then you have to laugh at yourself because you just had a fear response when you literally went in paying your money going, man, I hope this $12 scares me. It's the goal. You want to be startled. You want to be scared. I had this, one of my favorite theatrical experiences of one of my films was a movie called Haunted House in Sorority Row. We were doing a second show and we had maybe 50 people in the theater. And a lot of them were just total strangers. And there were these two kids sitting not far from me, maybe 2 rows up and on the other side of the aisle. And they were talking to each other, not hugely loud, but they were talking to each other, not necessarily saying bad things, but not necessarily saying good things. Well, there was one scene where there was a jump scare, and it was a small jump scare. And it happened, and the guy turned to the other guy and was like, that wasn't even scary. I immediately started watching them because there was a bigger jump scare literally about 16 seconds later. And when that jump scare happened and the music went all the way up and it blasted, I watched the guy who was talking go like that and then turn his friend and go, all right, that one got me. I was like, that's the movie experience, we're all just, when you're 5 seconds from crying, you're 8 seconds from laughing,
Well, and a good storyteller is going to know the biology of how you want people to react. Because part of the joy of horror movies is, you want to take your date to it in the hopes that she's going to cuddle up a little. You know, there's an intrinsic link between sex and death. And so as we're talking about horror and fear and scares, we want to approach something that scares us in a safe environment, quote unquote safe environment, because that gives us that little jump start that then we get to go play with later on and sort of relive. So I mean, it's worth it to know why we react the way we do with the jump scares, you know, or that sense of dread in the story. But I mean, I think humor is absolutely necessary. I've got friends that write grimdark, and I'm like, yeah, see, I'd be the one that's walking by with a gallows humor. And if you don't have that guy to release the pressure, occasionally, then it's really hard to keep that pace and that tension unless you can break it now and then.
It's exhausting to keep that dread going. No, I mean, for everybody involved, whoever's writing it, whoever's editing it, whoever's watching it.
A story should have plenty of contrast. Otherwise, you just get that constant humming where everything's just at a tension pace there where people either get bored or exhausted, and you need to fluctuate a little bit more and take them through a ride of emotions. And with good horror, you want to tease the horror, but you don't want to just like constantly blast them with dread or like splatterpunk where you just gore all the time. If you use gore only a little bit or something dreadful happening only a couple times throughout the story, those are just going to have like such a huge impact versus like a constant stream of it.
I always liked the stuff that you had to fill in the blanks, you know, and that was when I did my movie Misfit. That was something because that was like my first real horror film, I guess. When I did it, I remember learning growing up with filmmaking. I went to the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, and I just remember my directing teacher there talking about what you don't see sometimes is scarier than what you do see. I did a few of those things in Misfit. One of them was during a torture scene where, and I'll never forget this because we had about 150 people in this theater, and this guy, I had this surgical kit, and there was this one piece in the surgical kit that has almost like an elongated needle. It's about that long with a plastic handle on it. The serial killer is trying to teach this young bullied girl how to enact torture using her abusive mother. And they've got her and her boyfriend tied to the bed. Well, she takes this needle thing and grabs her foot, and he tells her to insert the needle underneath her big toe, underneath the toenail. And so you see it come down to the toenail, and I'll never forget watching practically everybody in that room like this, like, and with their fingers looking through. And some people go, no, don't do it. But I never showed it. Now I could guarantee there's probably 15 or 20 people in that room that will say, oh my God, that part where you stuck the needle in between her toenail. God, that was so gross. But your mind fills in the blanks.
I'm curious about tropes too, because horror has a lot of tropes, and I'm curious if there's certain ones that you guys gravitated towards that you always tend to use.
I've always loved the single location, short time span story.
Yeah.
I like when things are in like one house or one office building or one woods, and they take place maybe over the course of 20 hours. And a lot of times those decisions are made budgetarily, but I find them more scary. I find them more urgent. I don't find a movie where you change locations a lot that scary because it feels like there's just so many places to run. You're in a big world, which means there's lots of places to run, lots of places to hide. But when you're locked in the damn house with a ghost, you're locked in the damn house with a ghost.
Time ones are kind of the biggest trope for me, where it brings the most tension too and urgency in a story, because then you actually get a sense of something's happening. You need to get it figured out now. There's no messing around.
One thing I like to play with is losing the sense of time. is something a matter of seconds, minutes, days. Because you can get somebody who is in that level of disorientation and you can carry the reader there, not knowing what day it is much more impactful than a lot of people would think it is. And one of the things I was working on, I had the editor was like, I don't have timeline. I said, nope, and neither do they. They don't know until they've come out later. It's been weeks. The story feels like it's gone over a matter of maybe 2 or 3 days, and it's been weeks. And that's really part of that punch you come out with is, oh my God, they survived that long through all of that. Losing that track of a sense of time, is one of those things that really can play on people.
When we came up with the short film idea for my movie called Killshow, it was actually my daughter. She was 16, I believe, when she and I came up with the idea and wrote that. And it was a killer clown, but it was a killer clown with a reason. It was, she had turned into kind of this homicidal maniac because of things that had happened. So it wasn't, it wasn't a ghost, or it wasn't, it was a situation that made something in her mind snap and feel like, you know what, everybody is a bad person. And so now I need to eliminate the bad people. And that was something that, that you get people that think that, there's stuff like that happens all the time. And then with our movie Rain, that it's kind of a horror film, kind of a psychological, I'm not going to call it a thriller, but it's a psychological.
It's a mind fuck.
Yeah, well, that's right, Joe. You've seen it. Where a storm, a hurricane that lasts for 10 days with a young lady who has ombraphobia, which is a fear of the rain, and she's locked in the house by herself. I had a couple ideas for ghost stories, and they kind of got put off to the side because of the budgetary constraints. But I'm always good at grasping at something that's real.
Is that one of the more satisfying things for all of you? Is when somebody tells you this part really creeped me out or worked its magic?
It's nice. It's a very nice feeling.
Yeah. Well,
I've had people tell me that. Yeah, I've had people tell me, "Oh, well, I can't believe you wrote da 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 into that book," and I'm like, "I didn't." Oh no, it's there, and I'm like, "Did I write that? Let's go take a look." But it's really part, and I've talked about this a lot. Anytime good storytelling is a co-creation experience, a lot of our job, whether it's visual, whether it's on the page, whatever it is to do the setup. And because you can seed enough of the details to let people's imaginations fill it in so much better than you'd ever be able to do on the story. Because if you tell people too much, it actually loses something. That's when people really, a lot of the time, you let the brain fill in the pieces, tells a better story.
I just plain think it's scarier when there's few places to run and not a lot of time has passed. Because that's another thing that I've personally never liked in horror storytelling, is when like some great big realization happens about what's going on, the horror that's going on, the people who are dying, and then it cuts to the next morning. And I'm like, so then we're like, all right, I got to grab 7 hours though, or I'm going to be a grump tomorrow for my own death. I just can't do it. So I love that urgency of a small location in a small time frame.
I could sleep on this, no problem.
Yeah. You know what? Maybe tomorrow it'll all make more sense. Nope, still wearing a hockey mask. Shit.
The moon will cauterize itself. I don't have a problem with that.
It's just poison. I can sleep it off.
Yeah.